Hey, what is up YouTube? Kolst here, and I'm here to make this arena drafting guide for the current year 2023. And so a lot has changed very recently in arena, which has made it very important to actually adapt and change your play, and that's basically the reason that I wanted to make this guide now. I'm going to go over a lot of the key insights that I used to hit #1 on the leaderboard, even though since then I've been passed, but we don't talk about that. Will I be able to take it back? Stay tuned to find out. But in any case, the last time I made a guide like this was in 2021 when I made my general arena drafting guide. This is basically going to be an add-on to that video. To review what I went over in that video, I went over deck archetypes, how decks are supposed to look. For example, mid-range, tempo, aggro, control, attrition, these types of deck archetypes, but also how to use stats and evaluate the power level of cards and making basic draft decisions around all of that. And so for this video, in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat all of that information. I'm going to assume you know all of that, so if you want a refresher on that, I would definitely recommend checking out that video, which I'll put up in the top corner here, because essentially all that information is still valid, and to do the best in this meta you'll need to understand all of that, but you will also need to make some modifications just based off of the state of the game changing. And so with that, we'll use that older video as a launching point and go over exactly what those changes are, and make sure to stick around till the end of the video because I'll have some very specific draft examples from some of my past runs, which are all available on YouTube for some very specific examples of that. So with that, let's get right into it. To kind of understand what's really changed in Hearthstone, I'm going to make an analogy here where we think of arena and Hearthstone in general as a cupcake. Stick with me here. So cupcakes are great little pieces of food, so you have the bread of the cupcake, but then you also have the frosting on top, right? You can think of the bread, essentially, this is the foundational stuff, a lot of what I went over in that 2021 video. That's like your basic curve, your river crocs, your spider tanks, your chillwind yetis. This is the deck's foundation that in arena typically has been what most of your decks have been based off of. The frosting on top, however, that's this kind of secret sauce, that's the big win conditions, the swing cards that can go off of that foundation and essentially, more actually win you the game. And what's essentially happened in a meta sense from Hearthstone due to pushes from the devs, listening to the community, is that essentially the devs realize that people really, really like frosting. So they decide, let's just make Hearthstone a whole lot more about the frosting and a whole lot less about the bread of the cupcake. So over time they've added a little bit more frosting, more crazy cards on top, and less of this stuff that just, is kind of like boring stats on curve, until essentially we're at where we are now, where you have this thing that still kind of looks like a cupcake, but it's so much frosting and so little bread that it almost doesn't look like a cupcake, but it's still kind of a cupcake, right? And this isn't this type of video, so I'm not going to go over like if this is a good thing for the game or not, but the point is that this has happened, and for a while arena had kind of avoided this because we had wild rotations. A lot of older cards of a lower power level would come in and keep the cupcake as being mostly bread, but most recently, now less than a month ago as of recording this video, arena has come back to a standard rotation, which means that all of the craziness is now in arena too. And in addition to that, this is combined with the fact that a few months ago arena lowered the offering rate of all neutral cards across the board, so now there's a whole bunch of class cards, because as well the neutral cards were a lot of the bread of this cupcake, and now you have just a much higher class card, which a lot of people find fun, but also just means that there's just a whole lot more craziness going on and a bit less deck consistency in that sense. So essentially that's what I see having changed in arena, and as a result it's just very necessary to actually change the way you're drafting and playing, because the old adages that, oh, you just play your curve and you just take good trades and you eventually win the game, like it's not like you can't win like that, but you're going to win a lot less than if you're playing a lot more into the actual game as it is now, which is essentially a lot more about the frosting rather than the bread of the cupcake. And so again, that's why I wanted to make this video. And what are you going to want to change about your play? Let's get into that right now. But before we do, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, comment, all these things if you like cupcakes or not. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are essentially on the changing state of Hearthstone, but let's get back into the guide here. And with that, I'll go into the concepts I went over in that 2021 video. So where I went over the deck archetypes here, some of the changes here. I mentioned in that video that aggro and burn don't really exist in arena too much. Now they kind of do. And one thing that's changed a lot is that, at least currently, this can change very easily in the future, but the top classes happen to be Hunter and Mage, which are the two best burn classes, and Hunter's more of an aggro class a lot of the time, can be played as control class too. But what is very interesting now is just the fact that because so many cards from the standard rotation do go face, a lot of even control games will often come down to burn spells, like Mages just getting a bunch of frozen touches and then just sending them all into your face. So that is the thing that just really never was a thing in Arena, and totally is. And I even had a Mage one time burn me down straight from 26. I had a deck just yesterday where I had Vexilus and I was burning people down regularly from 18. This is just normal now. So that's just something to be aware of, is that taking damage is always a relevant thing now. And another change I'm going to talk about is just the fact that because the power level is so high, there's a lot of more variance in just the amount of value that decks can have. And as a result, it makes control decks particularly challenging to play, at least consistently, because you're rather dependent on having a lot of that value, which you don't always get. So playing control is a tool that you need to have in your toolkit, but you can only really do it when you have some of these high rolls, some of these premium legendaries, or other just value generation discovers, etc., that you again just don't always have access to a whole lot of. Because it used to be a thing that I've talked about in some of my past videos, that you could just essentially mass up on low quality late game and try to win games that way. That really just doesn't work anymore. Like, you're gonna get fed on by more aggressive tempo decks, and other control decks are just going to outvalue you through superior quality of late games. That strategy really just won't work anymore. And a lot of the time, again, like control mirrors will often just come down to who has the better or greedier deck. So it's just going to be very tough if you try to force that strategy hard. And this is exacerbated as well by the increase in frequency and power level of discover cards. Again, things I've talked about in the past, like Venomous Scorpid. Now there are new cards like Nerubian Vizier, for example. Very accessible discover cards with very high power level. The standard rotation has made the discovers even more powerful because the standard cards are just stronger, so you're discovering from stronger card pools in general. And I'm recording this in March 2023, I expect when the core set rotation happens in a month, it will only get stronger. A lot of weaker core set cards will probably leave the game, so this is only going to be a bigger thing then. And the other thing I want to say as a direct result of these changes of the game is that you are going to want to draft a lot more for combo than you've ever wanted to in the past. I was always a very draft for consistency, just try to get tempo and just make things work based off of the average quality of cards. The thing is that there are just so many combos enabled and accessible now because it's everything that's in standard. Standard is very much built around combos. You do not win in constructed without comboing cards. There are no cards strong enough to compete on an individual level for the most part, except like Astalor, things like that. There are some good standalone cards, but mostly everything is all about how you combo things. And a lot of that has leaked into Arena, essentially, because you're playing with the same cards. So a lot of your Arena decks are going to look a lot more like constructed decks than they ever have. Previously, it would always be a bait to try to really draft a constructed deck in Arena, but now you don't entirely do that, but you're going to have elements of constructed decks. And as a result, it's very useful to actually be familiar with at least what the decks in constructed are, because they will give you ideas of what kind of things you should be trying to do in Arena. You still do not want to really force it again, but there are a lot of cards, and a lot of the most valuable cards in Arena are the cards that just activate a whole bunch of different synergies. A really good example in Hunter, I play the most Hunter myself, is Devouring Swarm. There are just so many things you can do with this card. It's one of those cards that's just unbelievably valuable for its flexibility. And just for another example, like a card like Selective Breeder, for example, which is a card that actually is able to tutor cards in your deck, you know, that can pull out maybe your premium legendary like Hydralodon. Maybe it just gives you more consistency by pulling out your Gargan earlier so you can infuse it. These are the kind of things you're going to be thinking a lot more. Like a deck tutoring card is actually going to really provide extra value now, more than it ever would have before. So the one thing that hasn't changed in that video is that I still recommend that you generally lean towards tempo and again only pivot towards control if you're really high rolling, as I mentioned in the control section. However, you need to do so with the understanding that if you are going for a tempo deck, you just can't expect to trade and just play kind of like typical the arena playstyle and expect it to really work out, because people will be pulling off combos and having a lot more value than you a lot of the time. So playing Tradestone essentially isn't going to work. And as well, the face damage is very valuable for reasons I mentioned previously, and as well, there just aren't a lot of punishes for going face. So a lot of the times you're just going to be rewarded for getting in face damage while you're able to. Of course, if there's a specific reason you can think of why trading would be very likely to benefit you, either that being some kind of punish like a specific AoE effect you can play around, that is still very valid. Or just denying your opponent better trades on board sometimes, but again, there are going to be times as well where you can see that they might get a better trade, but you just don't care because the value of the face damage is higher than the value of the board. As many games, again, will actually just come down to really racing the opponent to zero before you get to zero. And so with that, let's get more into detail about the actual draft decisions, and I'll get a little bit into gameplay as well. But essentially, back to original analogy about the cupcake, this is essentially how you draft to try to maximize the frosting on your cupcake, because that's really a lot more of what's going to allow you to get the most out of your games here. So the first thing I'll touch on, but not talk about too long, is class selection. So some classes essentially have better frosting than others. Currently, Mage has a lot of really good frosting, Paladin has a lot of frosting, Hunter has a lot of combos enabling it to have a lot of frosting as well. This is always a thing that can change with the meta though, so if you want a more up-to-date look at this, you can always look at some of my tier list videos, which I do put up to kind of talk about what the best classes are at any given time, but also you can get a live look by going to hsreplay.net. You can click on the arena section. Make sure to do that. Don't just go off of what the standard win rates are by default. And that'll give you at least a general sense for essentially, I believe the average HS Replay player is like a 4-win average player, so at least what the best classes are for a slightly above average player. I don't always think this holds true if you're playing at the highest level. Like for me, I think Hunter is vastly superior to Mage right now, actually, but even though Mage is clearly number one for most players, but Mage is very strong too. But anyway, that'll just give you kind of a general sense. At a certain point, you would want to figure out your own thing and pick classes to your own strengths as well. If you are a better Warrior player, for example, you're probably going to get better results out of Warrior than something that has a slightly higher win rate. But I think that's all I have to say there. Next up, let's move to actually how you make selections in your draft, probably the key focus of this video. So the thing is with the standard rotation now, which I'm assuming is going to be a thing. Oh, I probably should have mentioned like earlier on this, if it ever does go back to a wild rotation, you might want to go back to more like the concepts of my older video and listen less to the stuff now. But I'm again assuming that this is a standard meta with really high power level cards. As a result of that, drafting has become much more difficult because picks are very often much closer in power level than used to. I mentioned in the 2021 Arena Guide, a lot of the time there are picks, there's just a clear best pick that you just have to take. Now it's really not that way anymore. Sometimes there is, but a lot of the times you actually do have 2 or even 3 out of the 3 picks worth considering taking in a given draft pick. So that just makes the draft decisions a lot harder. It used to be I would very often only spend like 4 or 5 minutes on a draft. Now I think my average draft is probably between 10 and some of my drafts even go to like 15 minutes in length, because there's just so much more to think about. The way you choose the cards hasn't fundamentally changed, but there is a lot more about enabling combos for this meta that you want to be thinking about now. And this is what I would have said and did say in the earlier drafting guide, is that early on you really just want to pick the strongest card 9 times, really 99 times out of 100. But now you still want to do that, but you also particularly want to value cards that enable combos as well, such as, just for example, in Hunter, that selective breeder, that harpoon gun, these kind of cards that can really get you some possible upside. I would heavily lean in favor of those cards if it's close, because early on you just really want to have as many possible combos to go for as possible, because later on in the draft you'll have a much better idea what combos you actually have access to. You won't just want to go for whatever random combo might work. you'll look at your deck and you figure out what combos you actually will get value out of, and then you'll only pick those. And as a result, like later on in the draft, I will give up way more value than I ever would have to particularly get those combos that I have, rather than just picking the strongest card if it's, you know, a very big payoff combo. But again, by the later part of the draft, you only do this if you have the combo in your deck. If it's like in the pick 20s or so, like you just do not really go for, oh, this might be nice. Like, you know, if you don't have it, just assume you won't have it, because more often than not, that'll be the better decision. And the other thing I want to mention is about the curve. So again, in the 2021 drafting guide, I went into a whole bunch of detail about what the curve should generally look like. That hasn't completely gone away, but simply put, curve is just a lot less important than it used to, because you will get some free wins by just curving out, but most of the time your opponent will be able to stop a basic curve. They're just going to have some kind of answer to slow you down. So you still want to have something that kind of looks like a curve, but one of the things is, again, like something like a Selective Breeder, which is a slightly off curve minion. You know, it's only a 2-mana 1/3. That's a lot better than it was, because you aren't losing as much from just giving up that one stat. So again, like something like an Nerubian Vizier or Pandaren Importer, for example, they're 3-mana 2/4s. Again, giving up a stat, that just isn't going to have the same downside on curve that it used to. Also, as a result, something like Bloodied Knight. This was a really good example. This is a 3-mana 4/5 that deals sometimes a lot of self-damage to you. This used to be, in very recent metas, this was one of the best cards in the game, frankly. But now, like, that self-damage hurts a lot more than it used to, and also the benefit of just having a slightly overstated minion, it's not as unique as it used to be, and also it's just not the same upside it used to. Essentially, this card would win games by itself, and now that just doesn't really happen that much anymore. So a lot of those kind of cards just aren't what they used to. You would essentially rather have cards that at least kind of fulfill the role as a curve minion, but also provide, you know, Spell Discover or other kinds of potential combo upside. So essentially, and I think this will hold true in the future, is that you go back to a lower power level meta again, the game will be a lot more, again, about how much bread and the bread of the cupcake. But now, essentially, you need enough bread still to hold something that kind of vaguely resembles a cupcake, but you really want to get as much frosting as possible in the cupcake. That's what's happened to the draft. So all your decisions should be around doing that. This is all very difficult. This is a lot more complex than it used to be, but I hope this provides some insights into exactly what you should be thinking about, at least in the drafting process. And so I want to, before we get into the examples here, I do want to talk a little bit about the mulligan and gameplay decisions that are kind of influenced by your draft here. So again, the mulligan is another very important, very underrated part of Hearthstone in general, but especially Arena. This is less true because there's so many decisions in game. In the lower power level metas, the mulligan was often the most influential decision you can make in the entire game. And people just do it as an overthought. They're just like, oh yeah, this card's above 3 mana, let's just toss it. But there's so much more to the mulligan. I have an entire guide video about the mulligan, so I would recommend checking that out. But the one change I would make to that video now as well is that, again, as the curve is slightly devalued, you should lean a lot more aggressively into actually even tossing away curve just to find your more powerful and broken cards and combos. Particularly, like, if you're going second, like, I would recommend tossing almost any curve minions except for a 1-drop, and maybe if you have like a really good 3-drop or something, you can keep that. But otherwise, I would toss almost everything almost all the time. And if you have a perfect curve going first, like, don't toss all of it for no reason. But again, you should be pretty willing to toss away, especially if you have like a lot of 3-drops. Like, just toss any 3 and just try to find more of your other stuff. That's all I wanted to say here for mulligan. And for the gameplay, again, this isn't a gameplay guide, so I'm not going to go super in depth. But the one thing I would say you should be thinking about more now than before is that you need to be long-term planning, which is a very advanced skill in Arena and Hearthstone in general, but like, you need to be planning to think about like what kind of combos you actually do have, because you will have situations, there's going to be trade-offs where, hey, you have this play, which is the best play this turn, but you can also hold this card, which could activate this combo in the future. And sometimes, you know, either decision could be correct. Sometimes you just need to do the strongest play now. Sometimes you need to hold the card for the combo later. It's going to be difficult sometimes, but again, you want to at least be thinking about this So at least you have a chance of making the right decision better than 50-50 by whichever one you just happen to do otherwise. Or always making one decision by default and then sometimes being wrong. And this is going to be something where, you know, before you get into the mulligan and into the game, you probably want to, again, do a post-draft review of just kind of what your deck looks like, so you're at least aware of what these things are, so you don't have to, you know, think about this all at once, right, while you're in the middle of a game and you have other things to think about. And so with that, I wanted to, before we close out the video, again, go over some very specific examples of some of this decision-making in play and some real examples from my runs. So I have a couple examples from a few of my 12-0 Hunter runs that we're going to specifically go over, because I think they were very influential decisions that actually made a difference in making those decks go 12-0. So the first pick I have here is a legendary pick. I might as well decided I'd make one that was a little bit fancier, but this one was a very interesting one because this was a very powerful Hunter deck. We already have an Astalor, very strong deck, but here's a Queen Ashara versus a Nyxia versus Baron Geddon. What's interesting is that this is a deck that doesn't actually have a whole lot of spells, so you know that would make you lean heavily away from the Queen Ashara typically. And so this is a very interesting one because I think if you look at different metas, this pick could really go any of these three directions. Like Nyxia is just the most stats for its cost, essentially guaranteed value, but it's very slow in this meta. A 9-mana minion that just gets stats, and it's an 8/8, which, you know, gets dealt with more often, so you're not really expecting any value out of the Nyxia. It's just a lot weaker than the other options here. So in a past meta, that might have been the pick, but in this meta, you just completely throw that one out, not really in consideration. Now, in some more recent metas, you would really lean towards the Baron Geddon. You are a hunter, so and that thing does go face, and that's very valuable. And hey, we don't have a lot of AoE in this deck, so that could be good. However, as a hunter also, you might be AoEing your own board, so that could be very bad. It's a trade-off, but if you're taking the most consistent standalone value card, I do believe Baron Geddon would be the pick here. However, again, as I mentioned, I'm not sure that I'm always even going to want Baron Geddon on 7. I have 2 Mountain Bears already to play on 7, so it's not clear to me that Baron Geddon is always going to be good. And that leads us to the third pick, which is the Queen Ashara, where even though currently we only have 4 spells in the deck, there is a chance it works, and I might just need a 5-mana 5/5 as well. And again, I draft a lot more for upside now, so Queen Ashara getting that Colossal potentially can be a game-winning thing. And that was the decision that I made. We were fortunately able to grab another spell via a Geist, which made a big difference for being able to activate it. Some of the dredges as well in the deck helped us to dredge up some spells to be able to activate it as well. And there were a few games where that Colossal was very key to victory. That was, I think, a very interesting pick for this meta. And with that, let's go into a second example here, which is from a different 12-0 run. This one had a Hydralodon, which is a very key influence of this pick. And we have a Death's Head Cultist, which is it's a bad card. That one's immediately out. So it's between a Sin Runner and a Warsong Wrangler here. This is another very interesting one because, I mean, this is also very late in the draft. This is pick 29. And we don't have a single 5-drop in the deck. So, you know, the old we need curve philosophy would lean you very heavily towards Sin Runner here. We even have a Harpoon Gun to potentially cheat it out. However, again, as I mentioned, you know, very critical piece here, we have a Hydralodon. So Warsong Wrangler tutors a beast out of your deck, and again, we have a Hydralodon. So that is just so much potential, and a lot of the time, the value of a Sin Runner on curve, it's good, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times Sin Runners just don't actually do that much in my experience ever, especially because I'm a very tempo-oriented player, so I tend to knock my opponents off board, so it just doesn't provide that much value. It'll just eat removal. So again, I made the decision to actually favor the Warsong Wrangler to activate the combo of cheating out the Hydralodon, pulling it out of my deck. I know there was at least one very specific example of a game against a Druid, which I'll put a screenshot of here, where if I did not have, I was actually able to get a turn 5 Hydralodon by giving up tempo on a turn to play that Warsong Wrangler with the Battle Ram to get that turn 5 Hydralodon to create the swing back from a game where otherwise, you know, I would have just gotten completely crushed. And I was getting crushed, but the Hydralodon was able to get me the game back into my control. So a very, very interesting payoff there. And at least I thought that was interesting. So I hope you guys all thought that this video was interesting as well. That's going to be it for us today. Hope this was useful. If you thought it was useful, let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, click the bell to be notified for future videos, and including me going live. I've been going live on YouTube a couple times a week now. Of course, I always go live on Twitch a lot of the time as well, so make sure you're following on both platforms if you want to see all of my content. But yeah, thanks a lot again if you made it to the end of the video. You are awesome, and I hope you have an awesome time in the arena as well. Thanks a lot. We'll see you guys in the next one.